The government promises a lot of things to a lot of people. Social Security, SNAP, Medicare, student loans, retirement, opportunity. And for a certain class of American entrepreneur, one of those promises has been the Small Business Administration's 8A Business Development Program. The promise was simple. If you are a small business owner who comes from a disadvantaged background, if you've historically lacked access to capital, networks, and contracting opportunities, then the federal government will help level the playing field. Not forever, not as charity, but as a temporary development tool. Lately, that promise feels like it's being quietly stripped away, not with a big press conference, not with a repeal vote, but with lawsuits, guidance memos, audits, suspensions, and shifting eligibility standards. So today I want to walk through a few big questions. First, was the 8A program necessary when it was created? Second, is it still necessary today? Have we reached a point where the discrimination the program was designed to address no longer exists? And finally, what do we say to the thousands of entrepreneurs who followed the rules, built real companies, hired real people, and now find themselves in jeopardy? This is not a partisan episode. This is a pragmatic one. Let's start with some basic history. The Small Business Administration was created in 1953. The core idea was not social justice. It was economic structure. Congress understood something simple. Left alone, federal contracting naturally flows toward large corporations. They have the lawyers, the proposal teams, the balance sheets, the past performance. Small businesses get crowded out. So the SBA exists to make sure small firms have access to capital, counseling, and federal opportunities. Not because small businesses are special, but because competition is healthy. Decentralized economic power is healthy. A country where only massive corporations can survive is not. That's the philosophical foundation. Everything else is layered on top of that. At first, the SBA itself was supposed to be enough. Loans, counseling, technical assistance, access to contracting. The idea was that if small businesses were given a seat at the table, the market would sort the rest out. But over time, Congress realized something. Even with SBA support, federal contracting continued to flow to the same types of firms. Companies with established networks, access to capital, past performance pipelines, and long-standing relationships with agencies. Meanwhile, certain groups remained largely absent. Women-owned firms, minority-owned firms, businesses in economically distressed areas, veteran-owned startups. Not because they lacked talent, but because large parts of American economic life had historically been closed to them. Some barriers were explicit, some were institutional, others were informal but persistent. The cumulative effect was the same, unequal starting positions. So Congress concluded that access alone wasn't producing equal opportunity. That's when set-aside programs emerged. Not as symbolism, not as preference for its own sake, but as structural tools. Set-asides do two very specific things. First, they reserve a portion of the federal contracting pie for certain categories of small businesses. Not all contracts, not most contracts, a defined percentage. Second, they create protected competitive lanes. Inside those lanes, small firms compete against other small firms, not against Fortune 500 primes, not against multinational corporations with armies of lawyers and proposal teams. That's the point. Set-asides don't guarantee success, they guarantee a chance. They carve out space where size and scale don't automatically decide the winner before the competition even begins. General small business set-asides, women-owned, service-disabled veteran-owned, hub zone, and 8A. The 8A program was formally codified in 1978, and it's different from the other set-aside programs in a lot of important ways. The 8A program is for small business owners who are both socially and economically disadvantaged, and who lack access to the same starting position advantages as many established firms. Historically, that primarily meant women and non-white men. 8A is not just a label, it's a development program. It has a 9-year participation limit for individually owned firms, business counseling, assigned business opportunity specialists, mentor-protege program opportunities, and access to set-aside and sole-source contracts. Now, let me pause here for a second, because this is where things start to get inconsistent. As I alluded to earlier, not all SBA set-aside programs are created equally or administered consistently. If you are certified as a woman-owned small business, if you are service-disabled veteran-owned, if you are hub zone, you keep that status as long as you continue to meet the criteria. There is no clock. There is no limit to how long you can benefit. There is no, you've had your chance, now you're done rule. You recertify, you stay compliant, you stay eligible. You can operate under those programs for decades. But if you're an individually owned 8A firm, you get 1 9-year window, 4 years in development, 5 years in transition. Then you're out. Even if you're still small, even if you're still disadvantaged, even if you're still competing against massive firms, programs that are supposedly about status, being a woman, a veteran, or being located in a distressed area, are effectively permanent. But the program historically associated with minority ownership is temporary and tightly constrained. Add to that the fact that, unlike other set-aside programs, 8A is a managed development program, which means you have to file annual business plans. Annual personal and business financial disclosures are requirements. Unlike most other programs as an 8A, you are subject ongoing eligibility reviews for the entirety of your time in the program, making it the most compliance-heavy and vulnerable of all set-aside categories. That does not feel like equality. That does not feel like consistent policy. If the philosophy is, we want to level the playing field for disadvantaged businesses, then either all programs should be developmental and time-limited, or none of them should be. Right now, 8A lives in a category all by itself. More paperwork, more audits, more reporting, more vulnerability, shorter lifespan, which raises a real and honest question. What exactly does the government mean by fairness and equal opportunity? Because in practice, it seems to mean different things depending on who you are, which leads to the next wrinkle. Even within the 8A program, a tier system exists. Up to this point, I've been talking about 8A mostly in terms of individually owned small businesses. But the 8A program doesn't only include individually owned firms. SBA also allows certain entity-owned companies to participate in 8A. That includes companies owned by Alaska Native corporations, federally recognized tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations. These entities can own multiple subsidiary companies that are certified into the 8A program, which means they operate inside the same program as individually owned 8A firms. That distinction matters. Now, I want to be clear. I am not against these Native-owned entities. I understand the historical treatment of Native populations in this country. It was brutal, it was exploitative, it was destructive. So I understand why Congress created special authorities to promote economic development in those communities. Alaska Native corporations were created in the early 1970s under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Instead of creating reservations, Congress transferred land and capital into state-chartered for-profit corporations owned by Alaska Native shareholders. The idea was to create long-term, self-sustaining economic engines that could generate jobs, revenue, and community investment. So when ANCs participate in federal contracting, the policy intent is not individual enrichment. It's community-level economic development. That said, once ANC-owned and tribally owned firms enter the SBA's 8A program, they do not operate under the same rules as individually owned 8A firms. Inside the same program, ANC-owned and tribally owned firms receive higher or effectively uncapped sole source thresholds, the ability to cycle multiple subsidiaries through the program, more flexible joint venture rules. Individually owned 8A firms do not get those advantages. So inside a program that is supposed to be about disadvantage, we now have tiers of advantage. Not between big business and small business, but between business trying to win work inside the same small business program. That's where I've always seen a problem. Not because Native communities don't deserve support. They absolutely do. But many other communities deserve support. Poor Black and brown inner-city communities. Poor white Appalachian communities, rural communities. Why don't they receive the same structural advantages? Fairness inside a single program should mean consistent rules, shouldn't it? If two companies are both called 8A, they should play by roughly the same rule book. Of course they should. Otherwise, we're not talking about equal opportunity. We're talking about prioritized categories. And since we are on the topic of equality and prioritized categories, I think this is a good place to touch on as a couple of hard truths. When 8A was created in 1978, discrimination was real, overt, and codified. Redlining, segregated schools, open hiring discrimination, closed professional networks, that world existed. But it is not 1978 anymore. Has discrimination disappeared? No, but it's certainly changed. I'd argue it's changed form. Today, disadvantage often looks more like being born into a poor zip code, growing up in and around underperforming schools, lack of access to capital, having limited or no access to professional networks. Those problems cut across race, gender, geography, which suggests we may be using outdated policy tools to address modern forms of disadvantage. This sentiment has begun to get traction in the last few years. In 2023, Ultima Services Corporation, a small business based in Tennessee, challenged the federal government's use of race-based presumptions in the 8A program, arguing that it was unconstitutional to assume social disadvantage based solely on race. That case resulted in a federal court ruling that the SBA can no longer automatically presume certain racial groups are disadvantaged, and must instead require individualized proof of disadvantage. The ruling effectively changed the definition of what it meant to have an 8A certification. No one is presumed disadvantaged because of race. No one is excluded because of race. Everyone must show individualized evidence. Recently, the SBA has gone even further in the redefinition of the 8A program. All race-based presumptions are now gone. Narrative disadvantage essays no longer required. Social disadvantage must now fit narrow, specific categories. On paper, it sounds neutral. In practice, it produces outcomes its founders had no intention of creating. I personally know of at least one firm, owned by a white male already certified as a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, who applied for and received 8A status. I'm not saying he broke any rules. He followed the rules exactly as written. And that's the point. The purpose of all set-aside programs is supposed to be the same: to provide opportunity to groups that have been historically or structurally disadvantaged: women, veterans, people in poor communities, minorities. But when you remove the ability to recognize group-based historical disadvantage and replace it with an open-ended, race-neutral pathway, you create a program that anyone can enter if they know how to navigate paperwork, which means minority-owned firms no longer receive any distinct advantage inside the program originally created for them. So while the ruling is framed as promoting equality, the practical effect is dilution. For individually owned firms, this was seismic, but ultimately only the beginning. Shortly after being inaugurated, the Trump administration launched a broad efficiency push under DOGE. Thousands of federal contracts were reviewed, thousands were terminated. Independent tracking showed that a majority of those terminated contracts were held by small businesses, including more than a few 8A firms. Now fast forward to late 2025. SBA launches the first full-scale audit of the 8A program in its history. 15 years of data, high-dollar awards, limited competition contracts. As part of this audit, SBA ordered every 8A firm to submit mountains of data, including 3 years of financials, copies of all awarded 8A contracts, subcontract agreements, payroll registers, vendor lists, updated ownership and control documentation. Then, just a few weeks ago, over 1,000 8A firms were suspended for failing to comply. So zoom out. Early 2025, mass contract terminations that disproportionately hit small businesses. Late 2025, mass audits concentrated on 8A. January 2026, mass suspensions. So to recap: audits, cancellations, suspensions, narrowed eligibility, almost all of it landing on small business. Which raises a fair question. Is our government still structurally pro-small business? Or are we drifting toward a system where only firms big enough to survive constant regulatory turbulence can compete? That's a real question and a core issue. So what does the future of the 8A program look like? The 8A program probably survives, but smaller, harder to enter, more compliance heavy, which means fewer participants, and more advantage for firms that already have scale, legal teams, and compliance infrastructure. That shift has consequences, because behind every 8A certification is a real business, real payroll, real families, real communities. When rules change midstream, people lose contracts, people lay off staff, people shut their doors. Even if reform is justified, whiplash reform punishes good faith actors. And I want to add something else here. I'm not speaking about this from the outside. I own an 8A company, so when I look at what's happening, this doesn't feel like neutral reform. It feels like unjust scrutiny, aimed primarily at minority-owned businesses. Layer that on top of DOGE. Layer that on top of mass contract terminations that disproportionately hit small firms. And it starts to feel like some of our leaders simply do not have much affinity for small business at all. Almost as if there's an underlying belief that small businesses, especially minority-owned small businesses, only exist because of government handouts, and are therefore inherently suspect, inherently inefficient, inherently corrupt, like we're all shady by default. That perception is wrong. Most small business owners I know are not gaming the system. They're grinding. They're trying to make payroll. They're trying to grow responsibly. They're trying to compete in a federal marketplace that already heavily favors massive corporations. And here's the irony. Politicians on both sides of the aisle love to say that small businesses are the backbone of this country. They say it in speeches. They say it in campaign ads. They say it at ribbon cuttings. But if small businesses are the backbone, why do so many of our policies treat them like a liability? Why does enforcement keep pointing downward instead of upward? Why does reform keep starting with suspicion instead of support? And another basic question, don't most Americans work for small and mid-sized companies? Not Wall Street firms, not Silicon Valley giants, small businesses. So when reform starts by destabilizing small businesses, you're not just hitting owners, you're hitting workers, you're hitting families, you're hitting communities. That's not abstract, that's real. So here's where I ultimately land. It's not the 1960s anymore. Discrimination is not what it once was, but inequality still exists. And today, it increasingly looks economic and geographic more than purely racial, which means our policy tools should evolve, but evolve honestly. That leads to a simple fork in the road. Either we get rid of all set-aside programs, or we keep all of them. But what we cannot keep is this incoherent hybrid model, where some programs are permanent, some are temporary, some are heavily audited, some are barely touched. Some get layered advantages, some get stripped down. If we're going to have set-asides, they should be governed by consistent rules. Either all are time-limited development programs, or all are renewable status-based programs. Pick one, because selective enforcement destroys legitimacy, and legitimacy is everything. 8A was never perfect, but it acknowledged a real truth. Opportunity is not evenly distributed. It should be earned based on capability and merit. Nothing else. If we dismantle it without replacing it with something better, we don't get fairness, we don't get competition, we get consolidation, and consolidation always benefits the biggest players. So the real question isn't, should 8A exist exactly as it did? The real question is, what does a fair small business ecosystem actually look like in 2026? That's the conversation we should be having.